Over the 3-day period from June 22nd to June 24th, 2007, the latter of which coincided with WWE's Vengeance pay-per-view, Chris Benoit murdered his wife Nancy, his young son Daniel, and finally committed suicide. It remains the darkest moment in wrestling history, but also ironically has finally forced through much needed changes to mainstream wrestling content and practices that has hopefully helped to safeguard it from happening again. Vice's critically acclaimed Dark Side of the Ring series opened its second season with a 2-part episode about the event, which featured in-depth interviews from the three men that probably knew him best, Chavo Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Chris Jericho, as well as Nancy's sister Sandro Toffoloni and Chris Benoit's son David. Obviously this list is going to be really rough going, so please know that going in as we talk about the actions of a man who shouldn't be remembered but cannot be forgotten. Here are 10 things we learned from Dark Side of the Ring, Chris Benoit. Nancy wanted Chris Benoit to quit wrestling in 2007. A key focus of the documentary is that after Eddie Guerrero died in 2005, Chris Benoit fell apart emotionally. As Chris Jericho testifies, Benoit and Nancy's relationship went from very loving to, in Jericho's carefully chosen words, volatile. Vicky Guerrero tells of a time when Benoit, during an argument with Nancy, smashed the windscreen of their car with his bare hands. Jericho says that his friendship with Benoit more or less came to an end after Eddie's passing because Chris became so much more insular, with Jericho even calling him a hermit. Jericho said, however, that Benoit refused to take time off throughout his career, and that was not going to stop now. I think he just continued on because he didn't know what else to do. Nancy's sister Sandra adds that in 2007, the year of the tragedy, Nancy wanted Benoit to leave the industry entirely, saying he was so grief-stricken on a monumental level that Nancy thought staying in the company and the business was eventually going to harm his well-being. The wellness program was full of loopholes. Despite Ring of Hell author Matthew Randazzo noting in the documentary that Benoit had 10 times the amount of testosterone in his body as normal and that it was, quote, irrefutable that Benoit was on steroids, he did not fail the WWE Wellness Policy program that was introduced in February 2006 to test their talent for recreational drugs, other medication, and of course, steroids. Randazzo argues, in practice, it would seem this original version of the program had large loopholes in it and large blind spots that allowed wrestlers to use drugs at a really large scale without tripping the test. And a doc shows texts that Nancy sent to Benoit about his steroid abuse, with one text reading, "We both know the wellness program is a joke." JR was the only WWE representative at the funerals. As anyone who visited WWE.com in the weeks following the Benoit case will know, Chris Benoit was erased from WWE history as the company washed their hands of anything to do with their former world champion. In fact, WWE only sent Jim Ross as a company representative to the funerals for Nancy and David. When talking about Ross being there, Sandra says the WWE sent JR and I lost my cool and told him to his face that he wasn't welcome at the wake. It was all a work. JR himself says in the documentary, "I felt like I was the most unwelcome person in the building because I was a WWE guy and I probably knew him the best of anybody there." WWE shut out David Benoit. One of the saddest new perspectives the documentary gives us is not only was it a horrible tragedy for those who died, but life was also really hard for those left behind. David Benoit said that he still considers his father his hero, that the man who committed the heinous acts was not the same father he'd known. David was a regular at WWE shows with his father and was present for Benoit's huge World Championship win at WrestleMania 20. However, once his father became a real-world scandal, no one from the company reached out to him. He says in his interviews, "Screw them, they weren't there for me. They backed off like I didn't even exist." Vicky Guerrero notes, "It was understood that we were not to speak of Chris, speak of Benoit, speak of anyone of that incident. That was something that was really hard for us to do, but because we all wanted our jobs, it was understood." The cops knew it was a homicide when WWE's tribute show to Benoit was airing. On Monday, June 25th, after finding out about the tragedy earlier that day, WWE ran a tribute show to the career of Chris Benoit. At that point, the only news the company had was that Chris, Nancy, and Daniel were dead. Jim Ross says in the documentary, Vince McMahon couldn't go on the air and not do anything, so he went on the air and did what we thought was right. We tried to honor the guy, honor his family, his fans, but we didn't have the full story. Shame on us for that, I guess. We did not know all the information. That's our fault. The show featured a lot of wrestlers talking about how much they loved and admired Chris Benoit. However, Chris Jericho was not present for that tribute show, declining to be part of it, saying that he watched the show from home whilst drinking a bottle of vodka. Dean Malenko says in the documentary that it wasn't until after the show finished that WWE learned the truth of the situation, and Vince McMahon made a public apology for it on the following night's episode of ECW. However, the documentary reveals that the cops knew it was a double murder-suicide and reported it as such as soon as they discovered the bodies earlier in the morning. Religion and the Eddie connection. Prior to his friendship with Eddie, Chris Benoit was not a religious man, and it was in fact Eddie that introduced Chris to religion and bought him a Bible that Benoit subsequently took everywhere. The documentary says that Eddie was trying to help Chris find his higher power. As already discussed in this video, Benoit took Eddie's death very badly and fell into a deep depression that fractured his home life until he started writing a diary addressed to Eddie, believing he was actually communicating with him. Dark Side of the Ring does take time to highlight the religious connections to the Benoit murders, with Randazzo pointing out that Bibles were placed next to the bodies of Nancy and Daniel, and that Benoit did write a suicide note and placed it inside a Bible. And one of the 2 internet searches that he did on his final morning, one of those were of a Bible passage about a young boy being resurrected. Some people still don't think that CTE was fully to blame. The documentary also features interviews from former WWE wrestler and now president of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, Chris Nowinski, who talks at length about the connections between Chris Benoit's actions and the multiple concussions he suffered wrestling. Nowinski says that Benoit, after he heard what Chris was researching, even approached him to talk about concussions, saying he had more than he could even count. Nowinski said that Benoit asked him to call him the following week, but when he did, Chris was in the middle of a heated argument and asked to call him back, but he never did. Nowinski says, "I wonder if the reason he asked me to call him was that he knew something was going on, but he didn't quite appreciate what that was." The Legacy Foundation contacted Chris Benoit's father, who granted them access to Chris's brain after his death, and they did extensive testing on it, doing a press conference to show what damage CTE had done on Benoit. Nancy's sister Sandra, however, thinks it was more than just CTE. She says, "It's not one thing. I think it's a factor of alcohol and drugs, and yes, possibly CTE, and stress and grief." Chris Benoit wouldn't want to go in the Hall of Fame. Chris Benoit will never go into the WWE Hall of Fame, and according to Jim Ross, one person who would fully agree with that decision is Benoit himself. JR says in the documentary, absolutely not. The issue is, if Chris were here and we could talk to him, he would say, putting me in the Hall of Fame is going to be one of the great distractions of the entire event. Jericho agrees, saying that Benoit used to tell him that while critics are critics, nothing else matters but the respect of your peers, saying that if Benoit could see how his peers now see him, he wouldn't want that. Jericho adds, "It nearly took down the whole business. What Chris did nearly destroyed the only thing he ever loved from a professional standpoint." However, David Benoit says, "I wanted to recognize Nancy. She definitely deserves the recognition she doesn't get." Jericho agrees, mentioning Woman, the gimmick Nancy had in WCW. "She's a Hall of Famer in my opinion. I'd like nothing more than to see Woman in the Hall of Fame." Sandra and David reunited at AEW Revolution. One of the most touching moments of the documentary comes towards the end. At one point, the Vice crew asks Sandra if she's had any contact with David Benoit or his family, and she replies that she tried and failed. "I was told, I won't say by who, that the children didn't want anything to do with us, and apparently the children were told we didn't want anything to do with them because of what their dad did, which was absolutely not the truth." This is followed up by an interview with David Benoit, which he struggles to get through when he is hugged by Chavo Guerrero, an executive producer on the series, and Sandra. It's revealed that Chris Jericho, who Sandra calls a wrestling angel, put them in touch and invited both of them to attend AEW Revolution. David and Sandra are shown enjoying the show, and David says that he still loves wrestling. The pair are also shown backstage with Jericho after his match with John Moxley. And finally, Sandra wants to forgive Chris Benoit. And perhaps that reconnection has led to one of the most surprising moments of the documentary, when Sandra reveals that she would like one day to forgive the man who murdered her sister and her nephew. She says, "Everyone deserves forgiveness. Everyone deserves mercy. I think within time, there will be a day when I get on my knees and I finally say it, that I forgive him. You never know, it might be tomorrow, but I do know it's not today." So that was 10 things we learned from Dark Side of the Ring's look at the Chris Benoit tragedy. What did you think of the documentary? We highly recommend checking out the series as a whole, and thanks for watching this, everyone.